properly in all of the states that,
Yeah, right. Yeah.
it's amazing how he kind
So,
of predicted it.
yeah. I think what they count the votes in Pennsylvania that Biden will win.
Mm,
But
yeah.
so because they're all from Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. So,
We are live now. Um, Welcome everybody. Thank you so much to all our viewers for joining us for the first talk in our series Opera and Conversation, which is a series of talks, panels, and interviews with experts in opera, composers, directors, executives, singers from all over the world who've been kind enough to join us and answer all your questions, despite all of us being very socially and physically geographically distant right now. Today we are so pleased to be joined by Mr. Anthony Davis, who is a composer not only in opera but in chamber, choral and orchestral music, and is especially known for his amazing improvised music and jazz over 4 decades. Mr. Davis has composed 7 operas, which include X, The Life and Times of Malcolm X, which premiered in New York City in 1986, and most recently, his opera, The Central Park Five, with libretto by Richard Wesley, was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in Music in 2020 and presented at Long Beach Opera in 2019. And I'm sure Mr. Davis is going to tell us a lot more about his work and his experiences and his expert advice for all of us today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Zelina Viliami, the president of Oxford Contemporary Opera, to moderate this talk and invite Mr. Anthony Davis to speak. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Priya. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Opera in Conversation, which is the series of virtual talks we are giving this term with, as Priya said, composers, singers, executives, and directors all in the opera industry. Please join us for our next talk, which will be with the director Barry Kosky on Monday. But without further ado, I'm really honored to be joined by Anthony Davis today. He is an incredible composer, and he's going to be giving a talk to discuss his work. So, Anthony, over to you.
oh, thank you. Thanks, Selena. And I'm pleased to be here. Yes, I I've been involved in opera now since my first opera was produced in 1985, and then was done at that was X, The Life and Times of Malcolm X, and I could talk a little bit about why opera. Why would I focus so much on opera? And I actually have composed 8 operas, so I have one more. so so I think I got first interested in opera before I even heard an opera, and I was living in Italy in 10th grade, and my father had a Fulbright to teach at University in Torino, and I had a wonderful professor, a teacher in Italy who had come to Italy to be a priest, go to North American College to join for the priesthood, but he fell in love with a woman, and so that was no longer a viable path for him. So he ended up teaching an English class initially at my school, and then he decided to start a philosophy class. And the philosophy class focused mostly on existentialist thought. He had sort of embraced existentialism, and so I read a lot of Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Sartre, etc. But and I was really, when I read Nietzsche, particularly The Birth of Tragedy, I was really drawn to what Nietzsche described as the binary of the Dionysian and the Apollonian, and I thought, when I thought about it, and it was sort of at that point in time Nietzsche was defending Wagner, sort of setting the stage, like trying to make a connection between Greek tragedy and the emergence of German opera, particularly of Wagner's opera. He later would repudiate opera, his essay Letter to Wagner. But I was really interested in this description, this binary, one of being the Apollonian, he's sort of referring to the form and structure, the rational aspect of the artistic experience, and then also the Dionysian, which is much more the irrational, passionate, in the spirit of revolution idea. And I began to think that what Nietzsche was describing was more applicable to American music than it was to German music. And American music uniquely because of the influence of the improvised music that comes from the African diaspora. And so this is kind of the naive 10th grade mind, this idea of this binary between that I could, then I began to think I could create an opera that had embraced both the improvised and the composed, the formal as well as aspect of the irrational, passionate, emotional aspect of art, and that could be the basis for what I would describe as an American opera. So conceptually that became the basis for what I was the idea of what I would try to pursue in the future. So then when I was an undergraduate student at Yale, I had a teacher, Robert Bailey, who was teaching 19th century music, and he was a Wagner scholar. So his whole approach to the 19th century was Wagner, a little bit of, like, we listened to Der Freischütz and studied that, Karl Marie Weber, and then we had Wagner and then a little bit of Strauss. So it was a weird way to look at the 19th century because we didn't really deal with, with Chopin or Brahms or Beethoven, and I'm a pianist, so that was odd for me. So I sort of rebelled against that, and part of my rebellion was writing parodies of Wagner. And so I wrote a series of pieces that were based on science fiction novels, with where I listed all the leitmotifs, etc. And so that was, but there were suites from my jazz group. So that was my beginning, kind of looking at Wagner, and looking at applying that to kind of a different musical form. And then finally, when was in the 80s, my brother is an actor, and he was performing in a play called El Hajj Malik, and he was playing the role of Malcolm X in the play. And so he came backstage and he said to me, I met him after the play. He said, you should write a musical about Malcolm X. So I said, well, I don't think it's a musical. I mean, we're going to have the dancing fruit of Islam and stuff, no. But I think it's an opera. It's Malcolm is a tragic hero. So I began to think about this idea of the tragic hero and Malcolm X, and so I began working with my cousin Thulani, I've worked a lot with working with her poetry prior to that, and that was sort of the beginning of my working on my first opera. Now the last opera I wrote is called the Central Park Five. And it deals with an incident in 1989. A woman, Tricia Miele, was raped and assaulted in Central Park. And this became kind of a media sensation. There were, at the time, a number of African American Hispanic youth had gone into the park, putting up a ruckus, throwing trash cans and rocks and stuff. But nothing like that violent. And so the authorities were initially arresting these young people for their actions, the actions in the park, detaining them, and with the idea that probably they were going to go home the same day. And then after this they found out about this assault, they furiously looked for someone to accuse. So they ended up arresting and detaining 5 young men and charging them with a crime. And they were ages 15, 16 years old. And Donald Trump, of course, got involved in this whole case. In a way, I think the Central Park Five case was the beginning of Trump's political career. And it has the same pattern that's been present today, exploiting racial divide, trying to exploit racial tensions for his own personal political gain. So he put full-page ads in the newspapers in New York calling for It says, support the police, bring back the death penalty. In support of the death penalty for these teenagers. And so there was a whole backlash. What was really the response was to, there was an expression that used in the newspaper called wilding. They said that they were wilding in the park. Now, wilding was very interesting because the expression comes from a song, the song that they were singing, which was Wild Thing, which was a tone loc song, a hip hop song. And so that wild thing became wilding when they said they were wilding in the park. What I theorize is that it was a response to the emergence of hip hop in the mainstream and the idea of hip hop, the hip hop coming from the South Bronx into Manhattan and Harlem, as a threat to the real estate aspirations of Trump and the idea of the gentrification, eventual gentrification of Harlem, and also the property values of the west side of Manhattan. So what happened was that they were arrested and eventually prosecuted and convicted of a crime and there was no real physical evidence. They didn't have DNA evidence or blood evidence or any evidence linking them to the crime. So they were convicted. 4 of the 5 were trialed as juveniles and ended up in prison for juvenile detention for 7 to 8 years. And then one, Corey Wise, was tried as an adult. He was 16. And he ended up in prison for 13 years. And what's interesting about it is that the police, in their rush to prosecute the 5, overlooked the fact that they had in custody a man named Matias Reyes. And it turns out Matias Reyes, who had already committed other rapes and murders, eventually confessed to the crime. He met Corey Wise in prison, early on, and so he became a born again Christian, Matias Reyes, and confessed to the assault and rape of Trisha Miele. And then when they tested, they looked at the physical evidence. All physical evidence pointed to him as the sole perpetrator. So this led eventually to the exoneration of the 5, but not without the cost, the price that they paid. Particularly Corey Wise, who was in adult prison for 13 years. So the scene I'm going to show now is when Corey Wise is released from prison finally after Matias Reyes' confession, and the aria he sings is called "They Stole From Me." They stole from me. The singer is Nathan Granner, and I'll try to play it. Let's see. Let's share. Okay. Let me put this up. Okay. No. Okay. Let's see. All right. Okay, that's a little clip from Central Park Five. And I've in composing the opera, it was interesting. When I saw the first draft of the libretto, which was several years ago, I was my intention really. I was working with this opera company called Trilogy Opera, which was based in Newark, New Jersey, and we had discussed. First, I wanted to do The Dutchman, which was Leroy Jones' Aunt Marie Baraka play as an opera, which would all be set in a subway car. Then the director of the company said, "Well, could I read this libretto, and recommend a composer?" And the libretto was from Richard Wesley. It was about the Central Park Five, and I was intrigued by it. I said, "Well, yeah, I would like to do it. I'll recommend myself." And so I looked at it, and it was very interesting because he had a mask figure who was sort of stood in for all the oppressors, from the police to the reporters to the attorney, etc. Who would appear, and also Donald Trump and the prosecutor. But when I looked, I said, "No, this opera has to have Trump in it. You have to have Trump as a figure in it, because I think it's important, because of." I think because it was the beginning of his career, and also that you have this real nemesis, someone who is actively working against the Five, and he's never apologized for it, falsely accusing them, and has never acknowledged that. In fact, he opposed the settlement that the New York City made with the Central Park Five, after, in a couple of years ago. So. So I thought that was important, and also essential to have a female prosecutor, because the prosecutors were two women. The assistant DA, one was a woman named Linda Fairstein, who later became a novelist, but they were involved. They were prosecuting the case, and so because I felt it was really important, this kind of feminist zeal that you would see in the prosecutor, who was seeing this idea that the woman who had been assaulted by these young, thinking that why she would leap to that conclusion that this young man had committed the crime. So this was and it's something I was living in New York at the time when the incident happened in 1989. So it was vivid in my mind, remembering the newspaper account as well as the television. The images of the five. Seeing the five young men being led away from the court with their heads down, and the flashing of the lights, and that became images that were in the opera as well. And something I vividly remember from that period in New York. So I guess I can open up to some questions. A lot of my operas have dealt with issues of race. I mean, from X, The Lifetime of Malcolm X. My opera Amistad, which dealt with the slave rebellion and trial of in 1839, 1840. So race has been a ongoing theme in my operas. The idea that examining America's racism and the sources of that, and how from looking at the heroic struggles of Malcolm X and his transformation from Malcolm Little to Detroit Red to Malcolm X to El Hajj Malik, to also looking at the origins of the principle of slavery, looking at slavery from the point of view of the Amistad Rebellion. So all those so these, I think racism is something that haunts American culture, and something that in a way is points to the really origin of American culture. It's hard to imagine American culture doesn't exist without the phenomenon of racism. Racism and slavery help shape who we are in terms of our culture, and why our music is the way it is. So I always look at the fact that cultural moments in which reveal who we are as a culture, and who we are artistically, are come out of, I think, also are aligned with these political fissures, these moments where America has, had to deal and be confronted by the legacy of racism. So anyway, so I can open up for any questions you have.
Yeah, I mean, that was really, really interesting. Thank you so much for sharing not only, information about the actual court case itself, but also your journey as an opera composer. Really, really interesting insight as well about, your comments about race in opera, which I think, given the political climate of 2020, it's been an incredible year just in terms of so much has happened, not only, obviously the sort of global pandemic, but also a lot more attention has been given to movements like Black Lives Matter, which hasn't really been done, I think, on a sort of scale like this in a very long time, if ever. So I guess I want to open with just asking you, how do you think, how do you think the future of opera will be shaped as a result of the kind of discussions that we are all, I hope, having around racism and around Black Lives Matter? How do you think that will shape the future of opera?
Well, I think it should play a significant role in this fact that I think that the interest in Black lives, certainly beyond Porgy and Bess, that's important. I mean, from to see it from our perspective, from the African American perspective, that well, people who have lived through 400 years of oppression, and I think opera needs to respond to that, and also the fact that you know, I think that also the fact that I think our music itself, our musical language, is born out of those things. I mean, without slavery, we probably don't have the blues. Without the blues, we don't have, or there's no vaudeville, there's no Tin Pan Alley, there's no Broadway, there's no, I mean, and what our classical musical traditions too. I mean, I think they've been indelibly shaped by this the kind of racial tension and and our obsession with racial difference. So I think I think it's natural for that opera addresses this, and I think there've been a number of pieces done in the last few years. I've certainly, with me, starting with X, and then I've done Amistad, and then now Central Park 5. I did another opera, Wakanda's Dream, that was dealing with Native American issues, the trial of Standing Bearer. So I think it's important that we look at our culture and examine it, and also that opera has something to say about these things. I mean, one thing about opera is that because it's not a realistic form, it's not like a made-for-TV movie or a movie or a play in that sense. You can say things in opera that an actor would never say. I mean, you could say what you feel, how the actor feels, or all those things. What would be part of the subtext or the backstory of a character can be revealed in opera. And so that means that in opera, we can examine a lot of the forces and things behind what creates these, I think, historical fissures, where these things, there's a breakage, or something dramatic happens. So to look at these dramatic moments and dramatic times through the lens of opera, I think it works very well, and something that I think opera can serve society in this way, and be very relevant.
Yeah, definitely. I think also the way that you mention how opera is so different to other art forms kind of obviously comes down to its music. So I was going to ask you, what do you think the unique role of music is in opera, and I guess more specifically in your own works?
Well, I think for me, music, for one thing, one reason I'm drawn to opera is that music propels the drama. Music is embedded in the action and in the drama, which is different from musicals. Yeah, I don't think it's the same way. I mean, there are exceptions like Sweeney Todd or West Side Story, maybe a few, exceptions. But I think in opera, the assumption is the music tells the story, drives the narrative. And for me, drive, I mean also rhythmically drives, because I'm very interested in my work exploring the idea of the momentum and the motion, the kind of inevitability of rhythm, propulsion. That's very important to me, because I think that and when I was particularly was writing X, composing X, I realized Malcolm had this saying. He said, "America violence in America is as American as apple pie." So I began to think about that. So this idea of violence, so the violence kind of haunts Malcolm all the way through his life, from the murder of his father to what his family experienced in Omaha, Nebraska, and then later in Lansing, Michigan. So I began to think about that and how I could depict that in music. So the music to me has this rhythmic drive. It's founded in I use a lot of rhythmic structure as the way Wagner used leitmotifs. I use rhythmic and rhythmic structures as a basis for memory within the opera, but also this idea of this relentless forward motion of what's going of how going moving toward inevitably toward the tragic.
That's so interesting. And you sort of, it's interesting that you mentioned Wagner there, because you mentioned at the very beginning of this talk that, you were inspired by Wagner when you first kind of discovered opera, particularly through the works of Nietzsche. Do you still see your operas as a rebellion to Wagner, or do you see it more as a kind of, I don't know, following his style or incorporating elements of his musical process?
Well, I think, it's a reaction to Wagner in certain ways. I think I've developed my own path, and I think with the incorporation of jazz elements that are part of my operas too. One of the things when I was talking with my brother about when we were doing X, my brother's initial thought that why that Malcolm X would be such a great musical was that Malcolm in the autobiography refers to music all the time. I mean, he was around music. He worked the dance halls. He talks about hearing Lionel Hampton or Charlie Barnett in the dance halls in the late 1940s. And I have heard stories. My a mentor of mine, Billy Taylor, used to have a radio show on WLIB in the 1960s, and the jazz show on LIB would come after Malcolm's sermon. Malcolm would give a speech, and then they have the jazz. So literally, Malcolm was there doing the speech, and then he would stay for the music, and might be John Coltrane Quartet, or Miles Davis, or Sonny Rollins, or something. So that was very interesting. So the conjunction of music, and particularly the evolution of jazz, is really tied to the political evolution. The rebellion and the civil rights struggle in the 1960s, particularly. And then you look at the musical developments like Max Roach's Freedom Suite, or Coltrane's music, or Miles Davis's music. I mean, so I think there was a correlation. That's something I drew on in X, that I looked at, also trying to find time, place, everything with music, and music by also referring to some of the music of that period. And that was interesting to me, but it wasn't enough. But I also had to find this through line, this idea of using rhythmic structures, etc., to make the opera have, I think, the unity and the dramatic force that it needed to have.
So you still think that opera as a term is still relevant to works that are being written today, particularly, I mean, obviously your own works, you still use that term. I feel like a lot of people are currently discussing whether that term opera is still relevant today, or whether we should use a different term. I was wondering what you think about that.
I like the term opera. I mean, opera means work. I mean, so I like the term opera. I mean, some people use the term music theater or something like that, but I compose operas because I think because of the way the music is linked to the drama, the way the music drives the drama. I think I'm very comfortable with the term opera, and I don't think that, I mean, this idea that opera is elitist, I think, is a fallacy too. I mean, it's probably the least elitist of classical forms. If you look at, like Mozart or, or opera in the past, it wasn't that, Mozart was thinking about dance forms from, in the 18th century, so when he was composing his operas, so I feel very comfortable with the term opera, and I think also because I love working with operatic voices. I love vibrato. I'm not necessarily looking for vibrato-less like Renaissance singers to sing new music. That's not my interest.
So, I mean, how do you combine in your music all these different elements? Because you obviously have a clear influence of jazz, and yet you're still working within the sort of traditional parameters of opera. How do you combine those two in a kind of synthesis, particularly with operatic voices? How do you combine both jazz and opera in that way?
Well, I'm fortunate in the fact that with the African American singer, you see these singers have experience in all in both areas. I mean, most African American singers have sung in church, so that church music. I mean, gospel music has vibrato, and as does opera. So there's a connection, a musical connection with these singers who have experience even within the jazz realm. When I first did X, I was working with a singer, Thomas Young, who's an incredible high note tenor. He can sing high Ds, but at the same time, he was a great jazz singer. He could scat, he could sing jazz, or Priscilla Baskerville, soprano, who sang Madame Butterfly at the Met and Aida, but also sang with Duke Ellington. Could sing like Sarah Vaughan. So I thought it was really interesting. So I think you had these I have these artists, these singers, and who have the ability to cross over to be able to sing with them, a recognizable jazz idiom, but also have experience in opera. And I don't look at them as opposed. So I try to make a music that seamlessly goes between as I said, that goes back to the Apollonian Dionysian idea that I presented at the beginning. This idea of that it can draw upon these improvisational traditions, at the same time have the power and expressiveness of opera.
That's really, really a really fascinating insight. And I think definitely, yeah, the sort of synthesis of the two styles for me is a way to kind of move forwards with opera in making it more of a versatile art form. Just turning to your works now generally, I wanted to ask what your general compositional process is. I realize it's a very big question, but when you were composing an opera like The Central Park Five, where did you start and what was your sort of compositional process, and how did you work with the librettist, for example?
Well, yeah, that's interesting. That varies a little bit. I mean, I think generally I like to see the libretto first, and I work through the libretto, and I do a lot of editing of the libretto with the librettist. I usually have suggestions, because I think that you need to have a coherent thought, a thought, something that makes sense in terms of the language, etc., and also in terms of structure, in terms of the structure of the piece, how you move through the piece. So usually have the libretto first. My first step is to put the libretto on the piano, and I improvise the whole thing. I just put the libretto. I go from scene to scene. I think about what the character of each scene would be. How I move from scene to scene. Maybe even touch on some materials that I might use that might recur, where things may come back, what structural linchpins I have in the course of the whole thing, and then I work carefully through, just linearly from beginning to end. Just start at the beginning, and then look at and let the music speak to me. Sometimes, it speaks to you through the setting of the words, how you set music. A lot of times I do the background before I do the melody. I might do something with the composing a setting a tone or a mood or time and place, and then developing the melodic material out of that. A few exceptions, like the last aria you played, I actually started with I did melody first, but so and then the process of looking at I mean, when I did X, it was a little different because also it was my first opera, so I naively I went straight to full score first. So I just wrote it for my 10-piece ensemble at Episteme. So the whole first act was written that way, and I didn't have a piano vocal score at first because I didn't know you're supposed to have a piano vocal score. So then I had to make one after the fact. And other ones I usually start with piano. Now I write for two pianos, like two piano score first, and then I flesh it out with the orchestra, and that's a revising process. When I go to orchestrate, I change things, and things have different weight. And I also usually try to think about the spaces in between the words. More happening, interludes, etc. So how the pacing of the whole opera becomes very important.
Yeah, I definitely see why writing for full score first might not be the best idea. You also mentioned a lot your kind of background in jazz, and I was wondering what role improvisation has in your music and maybe in the compositional process as well.
Well, improvisation is my other hand. I mean, what enables me to I try out ideas. I mean, I can just I look at the words, and I sing a lot when I compose. So I sing all the lines myself, and so it's some of it is allows me to have a certain kind of spontaneity about what happens next, of how the vocal line evolves, and how I move forward musically. So improvisation is intrinsic to that. It enables me to test out ideas all the time. And then I incorporate the improviser into the opera itself. I usually have a core group of improvisers within the orchestra. So I have had, Central Park Five, I think I had 5 or 6 musicians. I featured trombone, trumpet, bass, piano, and percussion as improvisers within it, and also someone who played the unlikely double of oboe and baritone saxophone. but I have to change that now because I only know one player who does that. But I think I work with improvisers as part of it. I mean, part of the language, and also now I work a lot with electronics and Central Park Five. I used a lot of work with Earl Howard, who he works on a Kurzweil, and we do live instrumental processing, so processing other instruments through it. The whole electronic medium has expanded the sound palette in a lot of my operas. I think since the first time I used electronic stuff was in Tanya, my third opera, but a lot, and I've done it. Wakanda's Dream featured a lot of electronic stuff, as well as my opera Lear on the Second Floor, and now Central Park Five.
Interesting that you turn to electronics now in kind of more of a modern setting. I mean, to me, that kind of, I guess, comes in line with the emergence of hip hop that you talked about in, the Central Park Five when it was happening in 1989. So I was going to ask, kind of, do you ever sample anything, or is there a kind of role that borrowing plays in your music, particularly in the Central Park Five?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. I mean, I think part of that, yes, I did when the kids go, when the teenagers go into the park, when they go into the park, first go in the park, I wrote this piece called "We Are the Freaks," and it's an intentional parody of a P-Funk song, Parliament Funkadelic song. And I was thinking about in hip hop how they're always borrowing people's stuff. I mean, when you hear a hip hop track, oh, the rhythm track is from this, and this track is from something else. I mean, the idea of borrowing is always there. Is always there. And so I wanted to have that sense because no, who's got the funk? So is sort of the basis for "We Are the Freaks." And I wanted to capture that because also that kind of energy of what music is driving them into the park. Music is bringing them into the park. It's so I wasn't going to do the Tone Loc song, do that, a wild thing, which because also what it says about women is horrifying, but but I think but also but I think this idea of "We are the freaks who own the night." So Richard wrote the lyrics. "We are the freaks. We are the freaks who own the night." So I sort of wrote a song about that. That kind of energizes them and takes them into the park. And then I did variations on. As that evolved, it moves on to a kind of more Miles Davis inspired electric funk kind of thing. That's in it. But that's something because I love different music too. It's like I do a lot of sometimes I use parody to create time and place, but the parodies are done out of love because I love the music, like Miles Davis's music is something I've always been drawn to from all different phases of his career. Also the electric part. And then, of course, there's certainly Coltrane and Duke Ellington and Billy Strayhorn. Charles Mingus has always been a constant reference point for me. In Central Park 5, the opening theme, I thought a lot about Mingus when I wrote it. Because the rawness that Mingus' music had, I've always been drawn to his music. I loved his music. And so when I was a student at Yale, I learned almost every Mingus piece I could, and George Lewis and I used to go down to New York to try to sit in with Mingus all the time, and he got sick of us. But we just loved his music, and there's something so vital about it, and sometimes I refer to him in different ways, and Ellington and Strayhorn too, or other composers. I do that.
Yeah, I mean, wow, I'm jealous that you got to even meet him. That's such an incredible anecdote. I mean, wow. I mean, I was going to say so much of your work is based around real stories about real people, which I find is a really fascinating way that opera has kind of moved in that direction. I was wondering if you feel any kind of responsibility as a composer to tell these stories and kind of represent these people like Malcolm X, like the Five. Do you feel any responsibility as a composer to do that?
Well, I think there is a responsibility, yeah, and also there's additional responsibility when you're representing a living person on stage. I remember when we did X, Betty Shabazz, talking to Betty Shabazz about it, and how I would represent her and what she would say. I mean, that gets to be very, 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 very interesting and delicate in a way. So, but I think also I think that I feel a responsibility to tell their stories, like Malcolm's story. I felt that was such a great story and such an important story to tell because and a way to revisit the kind of heroic role of opera. Who's our Siegfried? It's like I think of Malcolm in that way too. He's this tragic hero, and so when I'm working on his and getting involved in his story was in a way our story, the story of our whole people. Not just Malcolm's story. So that's I think it's so that's very exciting. And then when I was doing Amistad, looking at Cinque's story, Cinque who led the rebellion, You know, so it was exciting to me to bring these characters to life, and also these moments in history that I think so shaped who we are.
Yeah, definitely. I think the sort of political and historical element of modern opera is so interesting. I mean, I was reading an article the other day that essentially was saying that they think all modern opera from kind of the 20th century onwards, all modern opera is political. I mean, is that something that you agree with?
That's interesting. I think, it was very funny because I had a lot of pushback when I was first at X because they said, well, opera can't be political. It shouldn't be political. So it was very funny. It's like the old guard, the Janus at the gates guys. So, but I think so. I mean, I think looking at Berg or Kurt Weill or Weill and Brecht. I mean, certainly. I mean, it's undeniably political. I mean, Schoenberg too. I mean, so I think so. I believe that opera should have something to say. I mean, I'm not one. I probably wouldn't do a fluffy romance as an opera. I wouldn't be interested in that. I mean, even when I try to do it, I bring in other elements. I was working on this piece called The Reef that was based on an Edith Wharton novel, and the librettist had written her version of it. But we set it in the Caribbean, like a sugar plantation in the Caribbean. So inevitably race came into it again. So I think, but I think I find my way into that. I don't think I think the political's always there in my mind. I was a I was always involved in politics and fascinated by politics. As a kid, I thought I was probably going to be a lawyer and major in political science at one point. But yeah, but music just kind of took over. But I think by still that's politics and that world is still very important to me.
Do you have any advice for young and up and coming composers who are kind of dealing with these burning political issues right now, who want to write in, an operatic form?
Yeah, I think be ambitious. Don't curtail your vision. I mean, a lot of the people, they try to they think too small. They think in these, like I had a graduate student once, and he did it. He's writing an opera. So he said he was going to write this opera, and I said, okay, what's the opera about? Oh, it's about this couple, and they're going to graduate school, and they're trying to decide whether they're going to stay together after graduate school. I said, no, man. I mean, that's small potatoes, man. You can't do an opera about that. I mean, first of all, the music has too much momentum and too much in it. I mean, I always talk about the bloodlust that's in music, in opera. The stakes have to be higher. The stakes have to be higher. If the stakes aren't there, and it's like a wet balloon. It's just nothing. It's nothing. I mean, it's because, and I think that because to justify the music, to justify what you're going to do musically, I think that there have to be stakes involved, and that's something. I mean, I learned during my second opera. I was doing an opera. I decided to do the sci-fi fantasy opera. My second opera, kind of like trying to do something completely different from X. I'm not going to do anything like X. I did this very political thing. Everyone's asking me, what's the next political thing? Next political figure? And my brother would joke and say we were going to do Brigham Young or something. So I said, no, but I said, so I decided to do a science fiction opera based on my former wife's novel. So I did that, and it was interesting because she loved her character so much that initially in libretto nothing happened. Like they, no one died. So I came up to her and I said, someone has to die. I mean, I can't write all this music and build this tension and no one dies. That's not going to work. So it was very, very interesting conversation. But I think that's part of it. I mean, and I think the stakes have to be high, and to think about subject matter that's meaningful to you as a composer, and meaningful that you think will make a statement to the world. That you need to make when you're doing an opera, you're making a statement about yourself and what's important to you, but also a statement to the world.
That's really powerful. Yeah. Thank you for that really, really powerful answer. I'm going to turn to a few questions that we have from our audience. So the first one says, in response to winning the Pulitzer Prize for music for your opera, The Central Park Five, you mentioned how much it excited you that a political or operatic work could have an impact and speak to issues in our society. So this person wants to know what opportunities and challenges are posed for a modern day director in addressing such issues, especially in a predominantly white field.
Oh, for a director, yes. Well, I think for one thing I want to do is try to develop working with black directors. I mean, I think that the idea that how predominantly white the opera world is in terms of management, in terms of stage direction, all that. I think it's important that we develop directors and designers, et cetera, who are people of color too. But I think working in Central Park Five, I work with Andreas, who is wonderful, who's Austrian. So and he was helped so much in the dramaturgy of the opera, and also in how the opera was presented. And there were a lot of challenges to how to present Central Park Five, because how it moves from scene to scene, particularly the interrogation scenes, where you're moving in and out of cells, et cetera. And I think he came up with great solutions for that. And so I one of the things that draws me to opera is it's a collaborative form, and I really love the working in collaboration with other artists. Particularly the director and librettist, and that's something that draws me to it, because otherwise, when you're writing instrumental music, it's you alone in the room. Composer's just alone in the room doing it. I love the fact when I'm doing opera, it's not just me.
Mm.
And so you can bounce ideas off people and seeing things come to life through the creativity of other people too. I think is really, really exciting to me.
So what would you say is the process that someone needs to go about having an opera produced and then performed in a venue like, for example, at Long Beach Opera? How does that all come about?
Well, first of all, it has to do with the courage of the company. The company has to have the courage and the conviction to put its resources behind a project. And I was very fortunate that Long Beach took on Central Park Five, and also that they doing an opera like Central Park Five also involves an engagement with the community, a large scale community. We did panels with the people from the Innocence Project in Long Beach and LA, and that was fantastic, because I felt that we were discussing some really relevant issues, and also bringing in people to the opera who never would be at an opera. I met several men who were in prison for 30 years for crimes they did not commit, and so that was very moving to me. And also, I felt honored to represent their stories through the Central Park Five, and to realize that it's an ongoing struggle. I had a chance to meet all the five at an ACLU luncheon at Los Angeles and the ACLU does extraordinary work in America. I mean, resisting a lot of what Trump's done with immigration, the detention of the children, et cetera, the caging of children. I think that and they've been on guard to look at all these transgressions that are happening in our country. So, so that was very important to me, because I look at my music and opera as being part of the resistance, part of the rebellion here in America against, I think, the fascist tendencies in our country.
Wow. Yeah. So do you think there's a discrepancy then between the kind of politics you have in your works and the traditional kind of opera going audiences of today?
Yeah, well, yeah. I think. See, that's the thing. I think we have to confront companies with the idea. They always talk about developing new audiences, I mean, works like mine will create a new audience. I mean, when I did X, it was sold out for every performance at City Opera. That was in the '80s, and it was 50% African American house in Lincoln Center, which is kind of unprecedented. So, what we have to say, is the development of a new audience just lip service, or are they really interested in developing a new audience? Are they really interested in having patrons, having people come to the opera who are not from that's a certain class or a certain world. That has implications in terms of the how the financial structure of our opera companies, whether the reliance on philanthropy, certain kind of philanthropy. Certainly, America, unlike Europe, the European houses, which are state run, our houses are much more dependent on rich people, on the philanthropy of a few rich people, and that's one of the reasons that X was never revived in to New York City Opera, because of those things, and there was a resistance to X because of its message, and I think, but that's the price you pay when you do the kind of work I do. But I think that, but the exhilaration of seeing a really new audience, an audience that maybe had never gone to an opera before, and realizing that it could be relevant and speak to them, and they could be moved by the experience.
Yeah, definitely. Do you have any advice for, I guess, younger kind of composers, performers, or directors who, when coming up against these institutions for the first time, do you have any advice for them in, this climate where opera houses do often kind of program quite stagnant and kind of relatively unprogressive operas?
Well, I think that to stick to your guns and also find alternatives. Find may not be the big company who's going to do it. I'd love to have an opera done by the Met, but I don't know if that's in my cards because of the nature of my work. Because they're so beholden to certain financial interests, and but I think that you got to keep trying and build on. Develop relationships with people who are progressive and want to support this kind of work. And I think that's very, very important. And to find people who are passionate about what you're doing. The passion part is really, really big, because it's not about making money in opera. Not going to really make money. Doing opera is not a for-profit business, really. But I think that but what it is about finding music and subject matter and material that resonates, that makes a difference, that pushes the needle, that does something, that makes people think. Sometimes to be provocative is good. Provoking, always provoke. To take people out of their comfort zone. So I think that to me is one of the functions of I think, and the idea, and I think if and I think not to just don't compromise your vision. You really believe in what you do, and people will come around if you believe strongly enough, and the music is strong enough.
Some really strong advice. Thank you very much. We have time for one final question, and then we're going to have to let you go. So the final question that I have is, and it's a big one, what do you think the future of opera will look like, especially in a post-COVID world?
Good question. Well, I don't know what the post-COVID. There may be other viruses too. I don't know. We don't know what the post-COVID world's going to be. And part of it is we have to think creatively about how to deal with this COVID world, and it's been an interesting process for me. I know I was working with a project in Eastman School of Music, and they were doing arias from a number of my operas, but presenting them kind of as portraits of characters, and basically presenting them as music videos using digital processing, digital design on. So they film it with a green wall, you know, way video games and video stuff is done, and then you can draw on that. So it's like kind of like Avatar, or, well, those kind of films. So I think that was interesting because you could do these portraits of these characters that were in my operas, but it was separate from the whole dramatic idea of the whole complete opera. So so that was an interesting solution to doing how to do opera in isolation. You know, how you can do one character doing one thing. You know, so we have to look at to deal with what's happening now as a creative moment. You know, how we respond creatively to what's going on, and then hopefully that will help us maybe open new avenues after the COVID crisis is over. You know, maybe there's things that we can take from that will help us. You know, but yeah. So I think that's part of it. But there's no substitute for having, you know, live performance and people on stage and doing that. So hopefully at some point that can happen again. You know, I know there are plans to do the Central Park 5 in New York in the spring, but to do it in Central Park, which is ironic. You know, maybe do a performance in the park itself. You know, so we're using social distancing, etc. So that may be possible to do that, or do it in Bryant Park, which is near New York Public Library outside. So I know there are some creative solutions we can find to bring back performance. Also, when the virus abates, so at least somewhat.
Anthony Davis, thank you so much for joining us today. I've been Zelina Buliami. Thank you very much to everyone for tuning into this talk. It's been really, really insightful and just a very powerful experience to hear your words. Thank you very much. Please do join us for our next talk, which will be with the director Barry Kosky on Monday. That's at 10 a.m. And in the future, we have interviews with Judith Weir and Oliver Mears. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye.
Bye, Zon.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Zelina, so very much. Please do like this video if you enjoyed this talk as much as we did, and please do subscribe to our YouTube channel. All the links to our socials, including calendars for the upcoming talks, are included in the description. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day wherever in the world you might be.